Thank you, Rani, and thank you, Louise. It was an incredibly powerful story that you just heard. Louise is staying on stage because she's going to moderate our next conversation, which is a fireside chat with ASIC, which I'm guessing is the sort of chat everyone wants with ASIC, nice and cosy compared to the alternative. Simone Constant was recently appointed as one of 3 new ASIC commissioners, a role the chair, Joe Longo, describes as being a powerful advocate for Australian consumers and investors. So please welcome Simone Constant.
Hello, welcome.
Lovely to
Have a
see
seat. Well, a powerful advocate.
Powerful, yeah.
It's wonderful to have an opportunity to talk to you, Simone, and welcome to the AXI conference. I think these are your first public remarks since you started, and you've only been in the chair for maybe, is it 3 months?
3 months,
yeah. 3 months. So we're really pleased to have you here, and we thank you for choosing this event to share your early thoughts. So I guess interested in the room to hear a bit about what your early impressions are, what's standing out as areas of focus for you.
Thank you, Louise. And I do want to say thank you very much for having me here. I was just saying on the table to Debbie, pretty tough act to follow, the fireside chat with the regulator after that inspiring opening session. So maybe a change in pace, but hopefully not a change in purpose. In terms of first remarks, yes, this is the first time I've taken an invitation to speak publicly. A couple of reasons for that. Obviously, like, the time feels about right. I'm a few months in now, and I think it's important not to say too much publicly, have too firm views until you listen, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But also, great opportunity to speak here, not just because, I mean, congratulations, what a tremendous event you've got here, but when I think about the principles that, in my first impressions, I think are really important, like, it's actually so aligned with how AXI thinks about things, and that's something you and I have talked about. So it's a nice forum for me to come and, speak publicly for the first time, and at the end open myself to questions. In terms of those first impressions, the first thing I'd say is, like, I've got an amazing job, which I'm really lucky to have. When you think about the objects of the ASIC Act, and that striving for confident and informed participation in the economy of consumers, members, investors, it's pretty inspiring. And that kind of dawns on you once you become a commissioner and is at the heart of what we do. But I think other things I'd say is there were some principles that I thought were important when I came into the role. And actually my first impressions are that they really are. And they'll resonate for you because actually you capture them in your stewardship code. It's the concept of, transparency. Like, transparency drives better outcomes. It drives confidence and informed participation. It drives accountability. And I think first impression is that understanding of responsible entities in any way, shape or form, like whether it's a listed company or a trustee board, understanding their accountability through to that end investor, consumer, member, I think really important. And consistency, that consistency of meeting expectations. I think you talk about stakeholders and beneficiaries, like meeting those fair expectations. In terms of principles or first impressions on where I might focus, for those who don't know, which is probably all of you, my lead areas on the Commission are superannuation, markets, and also corporate finance and cyber. So perhaps pivot a bit around that, what might be important. In the superannuation and investment space, so this isn't just super, we're looking really at ASIC thinking it's important at the moment to focus on retirement, making sure we're driving outcomes that are right for people's retirement, a good retirement, and member outcomes, so member services. I think an early impression, and this is based on a lot of listening, is it's really important to be a bit more specific there. Like, it's quite a big topic, right? So to give people in the space who are acting in the space in the industry more clarity on why we might be focusing on, particular moments in a member's journey, for example, with a super fund. So, and that's something we're doing at the moment. I think listening is really important. It would be my another first impression. And informing up our ideas about priorities. I know I have been really trying to listen to the other commissioners, of course. I'm really lucky. I'm sitting with a really diverse commission. We have really diverse skill set and styles, and yet a real commonality of respect for views and for governance. Listening to industry, and there are some people in the room who've taken time to spend with me at leadership levels to talk about, I'm asking the question, what does ASIC want to hear? And I think that's important. Listening, of course, to Parliament and government, to whom we're accountable, but also really listening to the public through, whether it's through spending time. I don't know if there are any AFCA people in the room, but the tremendous people with their data at AFCA, or some of the groups, the advocacy groups who represent the public. So just kind of trying to get a broad perspective. And what I'm trying to say there is getting that breadth of perspective, given the breadth of who we act for and with, I think is important. Lots of priority areas, and we could talk about, I think it's important for us to really understand changing shape of markets, public and private capital, and what does that mean? Neither are better, but bringing that same transparency, accountability and consistency of outcomes, even if it looks a bit different how you get there, so there's that confident and informed participation. Other areas, I've got an impression that cyber's pretty important. It's probably important to all of you. It's what I keep hearing from people in leadership, like cyber. And I think cyber, and also just the sort of the new tech space, an impression I've got is it's important for ASIC to be really clear where our lead area is. It's such a hard spot. And, we heard then about, from the previous speaker, there are some spaces like financial crime where the system does work well together. My impression is everyone's trying to do that with cyber. So what part does ASIC play, whilst obviously remembering, when things fall short, we have to bring full force and effect to the law. So there's some areas of importance. And I'd say current impressions of the Commission, we've got a big job at the moment, cost of living, mindful of financial hardship, mindful of those impacts, mindful of a really changing economy. We've been really focused, for example, on greenwashing, and not through me, but my predecessors or people like Sarah Court have done amazing things there. But things are changing. We're getting a more mature space. So how do we think about in our strategic priorities different products or different markets in that space, for example, commodities markets, carbon markets, things that I know you're thinking about. So keeping pace with that change, refreshing our priority focus areas by listening and kind of looking at what's going on right now. But I would say, coming back to dear to your heart, transparency, accountability and consistency of meeting expectations, which can be really hard, or sometimes it can be as simple as saying, did you do what you said you'd do? Were you willing to explain it to the people you needed to, whether that's the public, whether it's your investors, whether it's your members? And when you did explain it, did they really understand that what you did was what you said you'd do? So, sometimes it's principles-based, sometimes obviously it's prescriptive, but those transparency and accountability that you drive for at AXI seem pretty at the heart, I think, of what we do.
So, not much on the agenda then.
No, it's a pretty broad remit actually of ASIC, but tremendous people who we listen closely to.
So I've got some questions that I'm going to ask Simone, but we will take questions from you, so put them through on the Slido as they occur to you, please. You've mentioned transparency and accountability, and as you know, dear to my heart.
Yep.
Interested in your views on the role of investors in promoting accountability and transparency.
Okay, what a great one to pick up with you. I've got views and early impressions as a commissioner, and I'm really conscious of sitting with you who has spent so much of your career driving this, keeping this at the heart of some of investment thinking. So firstly, I'd say investors have a really important part to play, and appreciative, I think ASIC is appreciative of organisations like yourselves, keeping that at the heart of governance. And that's the second thing I'd say is so much just comes back to governance, doesn't it? It's something else that we align on. I guess I would say how to think about it can be, again, principles-based and simple, the do what you said you're going to do, and also companies you're investing in, make sure they've done what they said they were going to do. We heard a little bit of that, I think, in the previous presentation, okay, if that's what you say you're doing, I hope you've got the data to show for it. I hope you can show that, explain what you did. But then, like all really important things, when you dive into sort of the detail and implementation, obviously it gets more challenging, right? But it doesn't mean we back away from it. And I've been thinking about this a lot, as you know, and I think it divides a little bit in terms of the activity or the space. So I think Stewardship, really important. And stewardship in terms of investors and how they deal with their ownership if they've got material holdings, that's a reasonably maturing and a more evolved space. Again, thanks to things like the Stewardship Code. So that there's concepts of like, say what you're going to do when you vote, or make sure that, that's understood how you've interacted. And that kind of leads into, I think, when we're thinking listed markets, whether it's the way asset managers or investors are operating in holding that, or the way they conduct themselves for driving confident, informed participation, it's arguably a little bit easier in that listed space. Like, even if you think about the activities of an investing entity, and that can be, a holdco, a fund manager, a trustee of a super fund, it's potentially a little easier to think about because there's some really mature tools and kind of external infrastructure. So there's stewardship codes. There's obviously, very clear listing rules and continuous disclosure. There's also the market, like a cleared market, a mark-to-mark market. You get that price discovery and you get that kind of constant information. But it sort of doesn't mean that any space is kind of better in this regard. Maybe it's just a little more challenging to think through. And then when you think about activities and stewardship in the private capital, and as I sort of recognised in my opening remarks, it's such an important part of the economy, and it's great. It's partly because there's so much funds under management for retirees in Australia, for example, or to support retirement. So got to think about that. It gets maybe a bit more challenging because there's more agency at the holdco or the the responsible entity at the top, because you don't have some of that supporting infrastructure. So when you're thinking about sort of agency and taking decisions, and to use your language on behalf of beneficiaries, or our language, investors, members, that those we want to be confident, I think it probably leads back to governance, doesn't it? Like, it's just, you need good governance. And it's not for ASIC to tell industries in different sectors, like, what the specifics look like necessarily, unless it, of course, falls short of the law when we bring full force and effect to the law under the Act. But it seems to me governance tools, it's about who takes decisions and what are the principles of that decision making, how is that recorded, how is information held, what are incentives like, what is capability. But with good governance, I think no matter the part in the economy or the type of capital, the market, we can see investors really bring their availability of capital, bring their function to drive transparency, accountability and consistency. And I think really nicely you and I would both align, as would our organisations, on that being really beneficial for what we strive for, which is confident and informed participation in markets, in the economy, sorry.
Yeah, and I think that issue about it all comes down to governance is something that we are aligned on.
Yeah.
We see that as being really key, and so every other environmental or social issue in the ESG bailiwick really comes down to governance, and it's about how are they governed by boards of the listed companies that our members invest in.
Yep.
So I want to just focus a little bit on ESG issues.
Yep.
And interested in how ASIC is thinking about management of ESG risks and opportunities across the market.
Okay, so we've got a really broad role, and again, it's about being really clear on where we have lead and why we're doing certain things. And I really like that at AXI you focus on E, S and G. So I'm going to start a little bit with governance. If you think about where we're trying to get deterrence or the sort of getting that confident and informed, as opposed to then when it falls short and we're sort of looking at full force and effect of the law, again, governance is really important. So we look at a number of factors in that regard as to how governance works to get that accountability, transparency and accountability at the top line for those engaged in these activities, whether they're whatever part of the value chain they're acting in. But to maybe go to the environmental and social, we have a number of important responsibilities this year. There's obviously the disclosure, the reporting regime. Probably won't go into the detail of that. There's a lot of depth, but we are committed to the idea of international alignment there, so that there is again confident, informed participation. We have obviously had some really important movement in the greenwashing space, which remains very clearly an enforcement priority. But as I mentioned in the opening remarks, building on that, recognising some maturity and the evolving and important space here in terms of environmental, also thinking about different parts we play. So carbon credits, ACCUs, for example, and the large polluter credits, they are actually finished products. So how do we think about that? And I'll probably go back to and this is not for us to sort of second guess what CER does, for example, on ACCUs, but when those products are put into play and how they're used and how they're described and applied, go back to that, like, is it transparent? Like, are you doing what you said you'd do with them? And if you have an entity, for example, that, you know, sort of advertises itself as being net zero and very green, and they get there by applying offsets, you know, for the entirety, is that consistent with what they've said, right? You know, we have a very important role in misleading and deceptive. It's always been there. It's not just because there's ESG issues and on the table. Is that consistent with what they said? Does it meet that? Does it meet that question? So these things are not new for ASIC, but it's just sort of new in the application. And then finally, I'd say, you know, consistent with needing markets that function, the supporting infrastructure, we obviously have an important role that falls into my markets remit to lead on in terms of, you know, new markets and the licensing around those activities. But we are really conscious that, I think I mentioned cost of living in the opening remarks, which of course is financial hardship, but it's also just anywhere where there might be, for example, misleading and deceptive conduct about, you know, why you're getting a discounted return or a company is pursuing a lower return or whatever it may be in the value chain, or why, if you know, even think about the energy value chain, if you're willing to pay more for your energy so that it is green, well, make sure that that is all consistent with how it got there, right? With what's been said.
Yeah. We've got a whole page of questions here from the audience.
Oh,
so
I'm 3.5 months in. I hope I can live up to it.
So we'll start to go to some of those, and one of them in any case overlaps with something I was going to ask you, which is with respect to the activity around greenwashing, there has been some concern raised about the risk of green hushing.
Yep.
And whether or not there's a risk that a lot of action on greenwashing is going to stifle or reduce people's, I suppose, willingness to be innovative and leading in this space. What are your thoughts?
I think, and I know this is something that's important to you. Everyone, like, I think, in thinking through this space, understands the commitments that Australia's got, right? And it's going to take innovation to get there. And we do not want to be seen as the regulator that stymies that, but we've got really important responsibilities. And as I said, greenwashing will remain an enforcement priority, and good work's been done. That said, I kind of go back to no one's required to claim green credit, or that they've got green status, or that this adds to, you know, net zero, that they choose to make that claim. And some products, some places, some investors, they do that for, like, excellent reasons. Right? But go back to, did you do what you said you'd do? Were you willing to explain it, you know, to the people you should be explaining it to, like that end accountability, like the person who ticked that option that it was going to be green, did they know that was going to be, or chose that product? Did they know it was going to be green through offsets? Did they know it was going to be green through, you know, certain financial products, or did they think it was going to be different based on what you told them? And I think actually, to be honest with you, there's really strong alignment in my sense of talking to the investor community, whether it's super funds, whether it's participants in markets, on this, on wanting that confidence. Like, this is one where we all want confident and informed participation and trust. Then when something is said to be green, if an entity chooses to say that or offer that choice, that it does what it says it's meant to do. And I would encourage people to hear that from us. Like, we want that innovation. And this is no different or new to, you know, any other of the long history of misleading and deceptive conduct. You know, if it is, it is. But if it's doing what it said it did, and you're describing it accurately, and your information is correct and transparent, innovation is an area where it's needed to get there. So,
just to go through a few more on the list here. So we've seen improvements in listed companies on diversity and transparency.
Another one for you and I.
How can we, or ASIC even, and I know you'll have views on this, help to have private markets disclose more?
Oh, wow. Okay, so I want to frame this by saying 3.5 months in, that private market question I would need to think through and reflect on, and I promised to do that. One of the reasons I wanted to leave a lot of time for Q&A today, sorry, I feel I have my back to that part of the room, but is, like, I do actually want to hear the nature of the questions, and it's an opportunity to not just answer questions but take them away. That said, I love the question, and it's something that you and I have talked about. The way ASIC would think about this is firstly to go, isn't it interesting what transparency drives? You and I really agree in transparency, but the gender pay gap report, and nothing to do with ASIC, but like tremendous piece of work, because, and there'll be all sorts of debate about like why those results say what they say, and this company's different for this reason and so forth, but like it drives that conversation. It drives that transparency, even in an aggregate level, which hopefully means, more accountability taken, which then hopefully gets kind of more consistency. From an ASIC perspective, trying to think purely ASIC commissioner, though, like it's about governance, isn't it? I mean, in my opening remarks, I reflected one of my first impressions on being at the commission is I'm really lucky to have the fellow commissioners. We're really diverse skill sets, kind of diverse ways of thinking, but this commonality of respect for good governance and decision making. And any time I've been at a high performing organisation or commission or leadership team table, it's been because that true diversity of thought is welcomed, included, and with a common constructive purpose, right, of getting to a decision. So it does seem pretty important for good governance, which is something that matters to us. In terms of private markets, I need to take that away, and I love the question. It's not our role. We are not sort of the Sex Discrimination Commission, for example, so I don't mean to overstep. But I do think it's a nice challenge case study for the private side, given what I was saying in my opening remarks. I mean, and because the private side of markets, in some spaces they have like higher accountability. Some private capital, of course, is into regulated utilities and things like that, where there's all sorts of transparency and accountability. But just if we think about private capital and wanting that same consistency in expectation of good governance and good outcomes, I think it comes back to, dare I say it, governance and representation at governance, for example, and acceptance of the importance. So it comes back to, I think, what I was saying about there's more agency taken on there to ensure that you get that transparency. But if there's a recognition that this is important and governance is important, then I'd almost be thinking we're putting the challenge back to that part of the industry along those lines.
Yeah. So
great question, though.
Yeah, well, we'll come back next year and we'll talk about it again. There's one that's come in that sort of is suggesting that there's been a lot of focus on greenwashing, rightly so, but is ASIC also thinking about other types of washing that might pertain in the ESG world? So I don't know whether it's pink or blue or social washing.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that something that's on your mind?
Yeah, and actually just on that last question, I just want to make it really clear that I don't think private capital is like necessarily a disadvantage for that outcome. Like in some ways, more direct, say private investments in large holdings, like more direct action can be taken. If there's not, and we're going to sort of opening up here now, more diversity issues than the gender pay gap piece, but more direct action can be taken. And as long as, I think it's important though on that private side, there's acceptance of the importance of those principles we talk about, and the role of governance and the role of diversity in helping a company, entity, investment, whatever it is, maximise its full potential. So in some ways more direct action can be taken. And actually that's sort of part of the same theme, right, of the next question. I think the principles are similar to what I said about greenwashing. Just do what you say you're doing, and have the data, the information, the evidence points. We all talk about data, and I think I am data driven, but sometimes there's not specific data, but there are clear evidence points. Have the evidence points to back it up, and if you're going to make a claim, make sure that that is there before you do, because you're not required to make those claims, but if you do, then make sure you've got the evidence.
back to greenwashing.
Yeah.
Some investors have aspirational climate change targets. So how does ASIC assess the validity of such commitments and on what metrics? And I think the second part of this question is, are you assessing the work that's being done through engagement? So, I mean, I guess it's pretty hard to do that. But I suppose the question really goes to, do you have the resources and the capacity to be looking at the broader, so not just a claim about a particular product, but a broader positioning around stewardship and engagement, etc.?
If it's specifically on the sort of greenwashing and what, as I hope I've been clear, it's regardless of product or whether it's an investment fund or whether it's a particular option, yes, we do. I mean, it's what we do. It's a part of the ASIC Act, the misleading and deceptive role that we play. And this is a priority area. We obviously, when it comes to enforcement priorities, we have a number of filters we use to choose the cases that we pursue, but we are required to bring full force and effect to the law. I think it sounds like there's something more in that question, though. Are we engaging to understand or to learn? Is that, what do you think is at the heart of the question?
I think the question is about, there's been, I think the high profile greenwashing cases so far have been about specific products where there's been a clear failure, whether for whatever reason. But more broadly, claims are made across the industry. And there's another question here, which to take it out of the financial sector, is saying, well, some of the claims that are being made by big oil and big gas don't seem particularly credible. So, how do we go to assessing those issues and, looking at whether or not the use of offsets and CCS, etc., are credible?
Okay, I really welcome the question, like all the questions. And it suggests to me I wasn't very clear in my opening remarks. But thank you for the question, which helps. I was trying to describe in my first impressions of what's important that as a Commission, we remain committed to the sort of enforcement priority of greenwashing in that space, but trying to think more broadly, or we do think more broadly, about this isn't just about sort of those specifics. And we do have the capability and we do have in focus some of the important elements of that question. For example, application by entities of carbon credits, not the veracity of carbon credits, as said, that's for another regulator, but application of them to get to goals that are advertised and claims that are made. Absolutely. So if that falls into our remits with respect to, misleading and deceptive, that's a really good example of how we're thinking about things, so how they got there. And again, that's why I'm kind of I don't mean to sound too generalist, but like when I say all entities that are within our regulatory remit, are they doing what they said they would do and willing to describe it to the people in a well-communicated way to the people they should be describing it to? So I think this is, I'm only 3.5 months in. I've got a lot of listening and thinking, and we do as a Commission, but this is something we are very focused on, and recognising that, for example, we went to energy, then you went to oil. Like cost of living at the moment, like energy costs are so significant in people's lives, and that goes to our raison d'etre as representing the public at ASIC. Like we have to make sure the markets, the products, the claims, the application, everything within our remit is tight and consistently meeting those expectations, regardless of the sector, regardless of the entity, so that that impact of that cost is appropriate and consistent with what people think it's there for, why it is what it is. At a very sort of different end of my areas of lead, we're really focused on, I've got markets leadership in area of interest, really focused on commodity markets and carbon markets for that reason, and making sure that if there's volatility, for example, in those markets, that it's explainable. If there's increase in use and development and application and sales and distribution of ACCUs, that is what it says it is and is explained. So that's something very much on our mind, looking at that end to end, rather than so that people don't take my remarks as thinking remain only targeted or specific.
Yeah. So we've got just one question to finish on,
Yeah.
I think, Simone, and this takes us back up a bit to the kind of higher level, and it's around your role as the Commissioner responsible for super. And the question is, there's a lot of trustees of super funds in the room here today. What are the key things that you would like those trustees to be thinking about?
Okay, so I think there is strong commitment from my discussions with trustees to those principles, unsurprising. Many of them who are in this room are signatories to your stewardship code. I'd love to sort of, hear more, see more about that level of commitment. Obviously, we are conscious, like you all are, of the changing needs of your members, and whether it's a retailer or a full member fund, that the changing needs of members as we have the ageing population, meeting the expectations of those members at that point in time is really important for confident and informed participation of members in the economy, and getting that kind of confidence through consistency. We are looking to really focus on the points that really matter. So at ASIC, we do prioritise. We look at data that might suggest systemic harm or points of real sort of vulnerability or importance of groups of people, real need, those real points of need. We want to look at that. We're going to be looking at that and trying to understand that, and good practices. Obviously, there's practices that fall short of the law. We will have, we are required to bring full force and effect to the law, but also to see good practices and understand, as everyone in the system that works toward good retirement outcomes prepares or steps into this period, how do we as a system work together? What are good practices for meeting those member needs, getting back to sort of those purposes, and promoting the retirement outcomes that are expected, the standards of expectation. So working with the sector in that regard will be something that's a focus for us.
Thank you, Simone Constant, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue and to working with you on transparency and accountability.
Yeah, thank you, Elise. It was a pleasure.